Well, to talk more about how NGOs can almost play the part of lobbyists and why the U.S. seems to insist on intervening abroad instead of focusing on its own budget woes, I'm joined now by Russ Baker, founder and editor-in-chief of WhoWhatWhy.com. He's also the author of Family of Secrets, The Bush Dynasty, The Powerful Forces That Put It in the White House, and What Their Influence Means for America. Hi, Russ. So I want to ask you, what role would you say NGOs play in shaping the way people view certain conflicts?
Well, they play a tremendous role, as your package mentioned, in Libya. That was the original source of information, or at least allegations of these mass atrocities, which we later found out were not true. Right from the beginning on Who, What, Why, we were asking questions about where that information was coming from. We were being told it was coming from Libyan human rights groups, despite the fact that we'd never heard of Libyan human rights groups up to that point. With Syria, right now, for example, there's a Human Rights Watch story that's circulating widely in the press. I spoke to the researcher from Human Rights Watch the other day. I think he's a well-meaning fellow, but the problem is that they're interviewing people who are refugees, and so by definition, these are people who left the country and who have a particular viewpoint on it. It's also very, very hard to corroborate the stories. They do try to interview people separately and see if their stories line up. But the problem, of course, is it's very hard for them even to know who's shooting at them. And what we're really looking at is a war. We're not necessarily just looking at a clampdown from one side. And so I think that's a defect of our reliance on the reporting from these organizations.
And as we saw, these organizations can play a very big role in shaping the way people interpret these events. Russ, to what extent are they held accountable for the reports that they put out?
Well, I think they're not held accountable at all. I don't recall post, let's say, Libya, anybody being held responsible, whether they were human rights organizations or news organizations, for highly defective reporting. And of course, that reporting ended up resulting in creating a kind of a consensus to okay a massive engagement by foreign powers in that country. I think that may be where we're headed again with Syria. I think there's no question that there's an agenda today. Hillary Clinton made a statement. She said she supported the ceasefire, but then she said Assad has got to go. I mean, that very clearly is an agenda from the United States government that they want this other government to get out. And you can bet that United States-based human rights organizations, although I think well-meaning individually, are under tremendous pressure to conform with that viewpoint.
So you're saying, in a way, these organizations can be used as a tool to push government's agenda?
I think they can be, because the issue is, even though I believe the individuals on the scene working for those outfits by and large are trying to do their jobs, what can they do? They're all outside of the country. And I have to say, the numbers I've seen in Syria seem to me way excessive, because those kind of numbers, if true, would actually mean that the Syrian army was just willy-nilly massacring large numbers of civilians, and I don't see practically any military doing that. Those are people who have family members in the country. A lot of them may have mixed feelings, and we have to remember that the opposition is heavily armed as well, and so how much of that is actually just shooting back and forward between essentially two armies rather than one army, as the human rights groups are portraying it, slaughtering civilians? I don't know.
Now, Russ, I want to bring attention to this case recently, a case of a man named Ghulam Nabi Fai. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he's an American charged with working for the ISI, the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence. He was charged for influencing American policy on Kashmir. So we should mention that he is of Kashmiri origin. So he was recently sentenced to 2 years in jail. So here he is facing time. But how is this different from people and organizations in the West attempting to shape foreign policy?
Well, I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves what any of these entities are. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party both have these institutes for democracy, and then these human rights organizations, they all have very large budgets, and I think there's very little looking at where that money comes from. By and large, most of these entities are supported with funding from large corporations, and we can be sure that those corporations are focused primarily on their fiduciary duty to their shareholders, which is to maximize profits, not to create a humanitarian foreign policy. So, I think that in these situations, even the human rights groups, which by and large mean well, need to be scrutinized much more carefully. And I do think it's very, very dangerous when we're dependent entirely right now on this sort of so-called eyewitness reporting. I covered the former Yugoslavia and as we said more recently Libya, and again and again and again we see the consequences of relying too much on anecdotal reporting, particularly when it goes through these Western organizations which are not able somehow to get in and verify for themselves what really is going on.
All right, Russ, thank you very much for coming on the show. Interesting perspective there. That was Russ Baker, founder and editor-in-chief of WhoWhatWhy.com, and he's also the author of the book, Family of Secrets, The Bush Dynasty, the Powerful Forces That Put It in the White House and What Their Influence Means for America.